To the US, where President Joe Biden is set to open a global climate summit today, marking the United States' return to international efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The summit opens on Earth Day, which ushered in the modern environmental movement back in 1970.
This planet is threatened with destruction. We are in a crisis of survival.
On the 22nd of April 1970, millions of Americans, mostly students, took to the streets to demand more environmental protection. It was the birth of Earth Day and an important step towards what was to become a global environmental movement.
Controls, they had pesticide controls, they had clean air, clean water. The list of environmental laws and regulations that passed over that decade after Earth Day, buoyed by a growing environmental movement, is quite historic.
Nevertheless, 51 years later, today's environmental problems are even more serious due to climate change. Since the beginning of industrialization, the Earth has heated up by 1 degree. It could be well over 2 degrees warmer by the end of the century. Today, it's once again mainly young people who are taking to the streets. This time, they're demanding a drastic reduction in global CO2 emissions.
But we young people have had enough. We say no more.
In 2015, 196 states signed up to the Paris Agreement, which promises to limit climate change. The Paris Climate Agreement has been signed. It was an historic moment. And when air traffic was reduced to a bare minimum during the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, it was clear that things can change. But even that's not enough, say researchers and environmental activists.
We should not underestimate the power of an individual to cause a commotion and get results.
Change is possible. Earth Day is demanding it because the climate clock is ticking.
Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Ajit Niranjan from DW's Environment Department. Ajit, is it already too late, as some say, to change course, or do experts say there's still time?
It's not too late for most people, but it is definitely too late for some people. Climate change has already caused death. It's already killed people in the form of hotter heat waves, stronger storms, raging, more intense wildfires. All of this has already had an impact. And if you look purely at even the air pollution from fossil fuels, that's estimated from the latest studies to cause about 8 million deaths a year. So it is definitely too late for some people. But what's also clear is that there's no kind of cliff edge beyond which it's too late to do anything. When I talk to climate scientists, they really stress that every little bit helps. Every extra step we take to cut CO2 emissions will stop the climate from warming by a little bit more.
Ajit, in our report, we saw pictures from the protests 50 years ago when the whole movement was launched, really. Today we have movements like Fridays for Future. Do these protests really change something?
We can see that climate awareness, people's understanding of climate change, has definitely become much bigger and more mainstream over the last few years. And scientists can't really exactly pin down how much of that is due to the activists and the protests, people like Greta Thunberg herself, or how much of that is due to governments actually sitting up and taking more notice of it. There was a big scientific study that came out a few years ago that really detailed just how bad the consequences of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming would leave the entire planet. And that's also been seen as a big game changer in how we consider the CO2 emissions and how quickly we need to cut those down.
Ajit, stay with us for a second, because I want to take a quick look at the current level of carbon dioxide emissions around the world. Because since 2005, CO2 emissions have been slowly increasing. But the corona pandemic has brought movement restrictions that meant that emissions dropped last year, as you can see here. Lockdowns, of course, meant less pollution and had some positive impact on global CO2 levels. But that drop is, of course, going to reverse when the economy is going to recover and when activity returns. There will, of course, be an increase in CO2 emissions in the coming years. With a sustainable recovery plan, the world could actually lower emissions, according to the International Energy Agency. And let's go back to Ajit there. Should we prepare ourselves, if we're looking at the CO2 levels in the corona crisis with all the lockdowns, should we prepare ourselves for CO2 lockdowns, climate lockdowns in the near future?
I think the pandemic has shown that climate lockdowns will not really bring us very far. The dip in emissions that's already bounced back, really, is not actually something that's sustainable, and it also only made a small dent in the overall problem. Activists are strongly calling for these systemic changes that actually address the entire issue and really actually swap fossil fuel emissions to, I don't know, energy from renewable energy and clean sources that don't actually pollute the atmosphere. Scientists do say it is a bit more complex, though, because there are changes that, particularly for people in rich countries, that will have to be made and that to some extent will involve a sacrifice. So in terms of what people can actually do to limit climate change, staying at home isn't something that really any credible scientist, as far as I'm aware, is calling for. But they are saying things like reduce the amount you fly if you fly, reduce the amount you drive if you drive, or even stop driving altogether if you can, and maybe eat less meat or eat less beef that comes from areas that involve deforestation. These are all practical things people can do to address climate change, but compared to the bigger systemic issues, it's only a small part of the big picture.
Ajit Niranjan from the DW Environment Department. Thank you, Ajit.